The sun broke over the high coral plateau like a raw egg yolk, spilling pale light across a land of red dust and long shadows. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised to a sky that was slowly bleeding from indigo to a soft, hopeful blue. This was the country north of Tombstone, Arizona Territory. In the year of our Lord 1885, it was a hard land that baked a soul dry and left little room for anything but survival. Down in the hollow, huddled against the raw gash of an unfinished railroad line, was the town of Dry Cedar. It was less a town and more a collection of desperate hopes held together by raw lumber and fresh nails. A place that had sprung up from the dust because a man named Silas Kincaid had decreed that his iron horse would pass through here. Abigail Hart, known to the few who knew her well enough to shorten it as Abby, felt the day's heat already pressing in. She stood outside Widow May's eatery, a place that smelled perpetually of bacon grease and stale coffee, and tied her bonnet strings under her chin. At 23, her world was small and meticulously ordered. She was a seamstress by trade and a kitchen hand by necessity. Her hands, nimble with a needle and thread, were just as often plunged into dishwater or kneading dough. She was a quiet woman, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that saw more than her mouth ever spoke of. Her movements were economical, efficient. She wasted nothing, not a scrap of fabric, not a word, not a moment. Her life was a ledger of small additions and subtractions. Each coin she earned was a victory, a tiny step toward her modest dream, a small sewing stall of her own, a place where she could mend the torn fabric of other people's lives and, perhaps, her own. And maybe, if she was truly fortunate, she could improve her reading and writing beyond the simple verses she could puzzle out from the Bible. The memory of her father was a dull ache, a man swallowed by a mine collapse, leaving behind nothing but debts that clung to Abby like the red dust of the high plains. The creditors had been relentless, their demands stripping away her inheritance until all that was left was her skill and her silence. She hefted a sack of flour onto the bed of the buckboard wagon, the muscles in her back and arms complaining. Old Man Hemlock from the general store had finally gotten the shipment in, and Widow May needed flour, salt, and a keg of nails for repairs. The wagon was old, its wood groaning under the weight. The left brake had been sticking, a fact she had mentioned to May's son, who had promised to look at it with a shrug that suggested it was low on his list of priorities. Abby made a mental note to be careful on the windy slope coming back into town. As she worked, she was vaguely aware of the low murmur of conversation drifting from the eatery's open door. The same topic that had dominated talk for weeks, Kincaid's railroad and the Apache. Silas Kincaid was a name spoken with a mixture of awe and resentment. He was a force of nature, a man who could bend the very landscape to his will with iron and steam. His railroad was progress, civilization, the future. But that future had a cost. His planned route cut straight through Stone Creek Canyon, a place the local Apache band considered sacred, a vital artery for their seasonal migrations and hunting. The talk in town was ugly and ignorant. It painted the Apache with a broad, brutal brush. They were savages, obstacles, a problem to be solved. Whispers claimed they were getting restless, that they were about to cause trouble. Abby filtered out the noise. She dealt in what was real, what was right in front of her, the weight of the flour, the heat of the sun, the precarious state of the wagon brake. Miles away, in the quiet dignity of the high desert, Mackay watched the same sun rise. He stood motionless, a figure of disciplined strength, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was in his early 30s, the leader of the Stone Creek Band. His face was all sharp angles and thoughtful planes, his eyes holding the long view of a man responsible for his people. He was not a warrior chief in the way the white newspapers imagined. He was a caretaker, a diplomat, a keeper of traditions. His authority came not from violence, but from wisdom and an unshakable sense of honor. With him were his sister, Anea, and his uncle, Red Clay. Anea possessed a sharp wit and a keen eye that missed nothing, a perfect complement to her brother's measured calm. Red Clay was the keeper of stories, his memory a library of their people's history, his counsel a steadying hand. They were on a difficult mission, traveling to meet with the territorial agent. They sought not conflict, but understanding. They wanted to secure a guarantee for their right to use the migration corridor through the canyon, a right that had been theirs for generations, long before the first railroad tie was ever laid. Mackay carried the weight of his people's future on his shoulders. He knew Kincaid's iron tracks were more than just a path for a train. They were a blade that threatened to sever his people from their past and their sustenance. He had heard the rumors from Dry Cedar, the fear being stoked like a fire, and he knew this was a deliberate strategy. Turn the town against his people, and Kincaid would have a free hand. The journey back to Dry Cedar was slow. The horses, sensing the weight of the load, plodded reluctantly. The sun climbed higher, beating down on Abby's bonnet. She guided the team toward the top of the windy slope, the final descent into town. Her mind was on her ledger, calculating the pennies and dimes. So focused was she on her small, tangible world that she almost did not notice the wagon beginning to pick up speed. At first it was subtle, a slight, unnatural quickening. She pulled back gently on the reins. The horses strained, but the wagon pushed them onward. She pressed her foot down on the brake pedal. Nothing. A sickening lurch, a splintering sound from underneath the wagon. And then the pedal went limp against the floorboards. The buckboard was free. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her composure. The slope was steep, littered with rocks and ruts. The horses, now terrified, began to bolt. The wagon careened downward, bouncing violently. The sacks of flour and keg of nails shifting and sliding with a deafening rattle. Abby's knuckles were white on the reins. She threw all her weight into pulling back, her teeth gritted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind tore at her bonnet, whipping stray strands of hair across her face. It was in that moment of pure chaos that the rifle shot cracked through the air. It was a flat, sharp report, coming from the direction of the low hills where Kincaid's railroad supplies were piled. A heartbeat later, a sound like an angry hornet zipped past her ear, and a splinter of wood flew from the wagon's side rail, inches from her hand. The horses, already panicked, screamed and veered wildly. The world became a blur of red dust and imminent disaster. She was losing control completely. The wagon was about to jackknife, to flip, to shatter itself and her on the rocks below. Then, a figure emerged from the shimmering heat haze at the side of the road. It was a man, moving with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. He ran not toward her, but alongside the careening wagon, his focus entirely on the right front wheel, which was wobbling dangerously. He reached it, his powerful hands closing around the iron rim and wooden spokes. His shoulder braced against the buckboard's side. He was using his own body as a drag, a human brake. "Pull left," he shouted, his voice calm and commanding over the din. "Keep their heads turned left." Another man and a woman appeared, moving to calm the horses, speaking to them in a low, soothing language. Spurred by his command, Abby found a last reserve of strength. She yanked the left rein with everything she had. Her boots braced against the footboard. The wagon groaned in protest, metal screaming against wood. It swerved, the right wheel lifting precariously off the ground. The man beside it dug his heels into the dirt, his muscles straining, a rock of stability in the swirling chaos. Slowly, agonizingly, the wagon began to slow. The terrified horses responded to the gentle hands and calm voices, their panicked runs slowing to a trot, then a walk, then a trembling halt. The wagon settled with a final, shuddering groan, tilted at a dangerous angle just feet from a deep gully. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the heaving breaths of the horses and the pounding of Abby's own heart. The dust began to settle. She looked at her hands, still clenched around the leather reins, raw and shaking. The man stepped back from the wheel. He was Apache, tall and lean. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a cotton shirt. His black hair was held back by a leather band. His face, etched with focus, was now turned toward her. His eyes were dark and piercing, and in them, she saw an intelligence and a stillness that seemed to draw all the chaos out of the air. He walked to the side of her seat and looked up at her. For a long moment, Neither of them spoke. It was a silent acknowledgement of the life that had almost been lost, of the shared instinct that had saved it. "I owe you my life," he said finally. His English was clear, precise. Abby's composure, held together by sheer will, finally fractured. She felt a flush creep up her neck. She looked from his intense gaze to her own trembling hands. She was a simple seamstress, a woman who lived in the background. Such directness, such gravity, was foreign to her. "I was only holding the reins," she stammered, the words feeling small and inadequate. The woman and the older man approached. The man who had spoken introduced them as his sister, Anea, and his uncle, Red Clay. He introduced himself as Mackay. Anea's eyes, as sharp as her brother's, fell on the splintered wood of the side rail. She ran a finger over the fresh gouge. "This was no accident," she said softly. Mackay examined the mark. His expression hardened. He looked toward the hills, in the direction the shot had come from, where Kincaid keeps his supplies. "I saw a man there," Abby said, her voice barely a whisper. The image was suddenly sharp in her mind. Just before the brake gave way, he was holding a rifle. There was something on his wrist, a mark, an arrow. I think it looked like it was broken. Mackay's gaze met his uncle's. A silent understanding passed between them. A broken arrow, the mark of Caleb Stroud. Kincaid's hired gun, the broken brake, the stray shot, the location. It was too much to be a coincidence. It was a message, a provocation, designed to look like an unfortunate accident. Abby felt a chill despite the desert heat. She had not just witnessed a random event. She had seen something she was not meant to see. She was now a part of something she did not understand. A piece in a dangerous game. The conflict she had only heard in whispers in the eatery was now real, its sharp edges pressing in on her small, ordered life. She had wanted only to haul flour and nails, to save her pennies, to be left alone. But the red dust of the high desert had a way of pulling everyone into its troubles, and she now stood at the center of a storm she could not yet see, with the steady eyes of an Apache chief fixed upon her, a man to whom she had just saved a life, and who had, in turn, just saved hers. The seeds of conflict, of honor versus profit, of prejudice versus truth, had been sown on that windy slope, and Abby Hart, the quiet seamstress, was the only one who had seen them planted. The arrival of Sheriff Tom Whitaker was as inevitable as the setting of the sun. He came not with a posse and a cloud of dust, but on a steady old gelding that seemed as weary of the world as its rider. The sheriff was a man carved from the same hard rock as the country around them, his face a roadmap of long years under a harsh sun, his eyes a pale, faded blue that still held a glint of unyielding iron. He dismounted with a slight groan, his gaze taking in the whole scene in one sweeping, practiced motion: the tilted wagon, the nervous horses, Abby still perched on the driver's seat looking pale, and the 3 Apache standing near the damaged wheel. He nodded once, a gesture that was both a greeting and an acknowledgement of the trouble. His eyes met Mackay's, and for a moment, the 2 men assessed each other. There was no open hostility, only the quiet, measuring look of 2 leaders responsible for their own people, operating under different laws on the same unforgiving piece of land. Sheriff Whitaker walked over to the wagon, his boots scuffing in the red dirt. He ran a hand over the splintered gash in the side rail, his thumb tracing the path the bullet had taken. He did not need to be told it was a gunshot. He looked at Abby. "What did you see, Miss Hart?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly sound. Abby swallowed, her throat dry. She had to force the words out, her voice small against the vast silence of the desert. "A man, on the hill over there, by Mr. Kincaid's supplies. He had a rifle. Did you get a look at his face?" the sheriff asked, his attention unwavering. "No, sir, he was too far, but I saw his hand when he lowered the gun. There was a mark on his wrist, a tattoo, an arrow, but it was broken in the middle." Sheriff Whitaker's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his expression did not change. He had heard enough. He knew of only one man in the territory with a tattoo of a broken arrow on his wrist, Caleb Stroud. And Caleb Stroud was Silas Kincaid's shadow, the violence that followed the man's ambition. He turned his gaze to the underside of the wagon, where red clay was pointing out the sheared pin on the brake assembly. It was a clean brake, too clean for a simple failure of old metal. It looked as if it had been filed, weakened, made to fail at just the right moment of strain. He straightened up and looked back at Mackay. "This is a bad business." Mackay's expression was unreadable. "It is Kincaid's business. His man, his bullet, his railroad." The sheriff sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath, proving it is another matter entirely. Kincaid owns half the territorial legislature and the other half is afraid of him. Stroud will claim he was hunting, that the shot was a stray. And this brake, he gestured to the wagon, could have failed on its own. It is your word against his. He looked from Mackay to Abby, and a flicker of concern crossed his face. "And yours, miss, which makes you a witness. That is not a safe thing to be in Dry Cedar right now." With that, he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode toward town, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The sun was dipping low, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The day was ending, but the trouble was just beginning. Red Clay and Mackay worked together, using a length of rope and a sturdy piece of mesquite to brace the damaged wheel and jury-rig the brake. It was a temporary fix, enough to get the wagon back to town if they went slowly. As they worked, the desert air began to cool. The shadows stretched long and thin, like grasping fingers. Abby finally climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady beneath her. The reality of her situation was settling in. She was no longer just an anonymous seamstress. She was a witness. She had seen the face of Kincaid's violence, and now she was tangled in a conflict that could swallow a person whole. "It will be dark soon," Mackay said, his work finished. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "It is not safe for you to travel alone. I will see you back to town." Abby stiffened. Her life was her own, her path one she walked by herself. She was not used to being looked after, and the idea of this quiet, imposing man escorting her through the twilight felt strange, an intrusion into her carefully guarded solitude. "I am not used to having someone walk with me," she said, the words stiffer than she intended. A faint smile touched the corner of Mackay's mouth, a fleeting expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. "I am not used to letting the person who just saved my life walk alone in the dark. My debt would not allow it." There was no arguing with the simple, unshakable logic of his honor. She gave a small, reluctant nod. They made a small, smokeless fire as true darkness fell, the stars emerging in a brilliant, cold canopy overhead. It was not a fire for ceremony, but for a little warmth against the coming chill and to heat a pot of water for coffee. Anea offered Abby a piece of dried venison and a flatbread made from mesquite flour. It was simple, nourishing food, and Abby accepted it gratefully. She sat on a rock, a little apart from them, observing their quiet interactions. There was an ease between them, a deep, unspoken understanding. They spoke in their own language, their voices low and melodic, but their conversation seemed practical, rooted in the realities of their world. Red Clay, noticing her isolation, began to speak in English, his voice the sound of dry leaves skittering across stone. He told a story, not of gods or spirits, but of tracking a great buck through the high country. He spoke of reading the signs, the turn of a leaf, the depth of a hoof print, the way the wind carried a scent. It was a story about patience, observation, and respect for the creature being hunted. It was a lesson disguised as a tale. He spoke of the seasons, of the sacred trust of sharing water when the land was parched. He explained that in their way. To deny a stranger water was to deny life itself, a profound offense against the balance of the world. As Abby listened, she thought of the rumors in town, the ugly caricatures of the Apache as bloodthirsty savages. She saw nothing of that here. She saw a people deeply connected to the land, their lives governed by a code of honor and a wisdom born of generations of survival. Then, Red Clay mentioned the laws of Stone Creek Canyon. "It is forbidden to fire a gun within the canyon walls," he said. "Not because of spirits, but because of the stone itself. The rock is old and hard. It throws a sound back and forth, making it impossible to know where the shot came from. It can make a man his own enemy. A hunter's bullet can come back for him." Abby listened, absorbing every word. She felt a profound sense of her own ignorance. Her knowledge was of stitches and seams, of the price of flour and the heat of an oven. Theirs was a library of the land itself, a knowledge passed down not in books she could not read, but in stories and traditions that were as vital as the water they shared. A wave of her old insecurity washed over her. She was a woman who struggled to write her own name, sitting with people who could read the history of the world in the dust at their feet. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, a rider approached their camp, a young man from their band. He spoke quietly with Mackay in their own tongue, his words urgent. Abby could not understand the language, but she saw the look on Mackay's face. His jaw was set, his eyes hard as flint. When the scout had departed, Anea came to sit by Abby. "Her brother has received news," she said, her voice low. "Kincaid's men are not just laying track. Upstream from the canyon, they are building a dam, a temporary one, made of logs and earth." Abby did not understand. "A dam for what for? Washing the ore from his new silver claim," Anea explained, a bitter edge to her voice. "He will divert the creek, build a pool, and use the water to separate the rock from the silver." "But what happens to the water after?" Abby asked. Anea looked at her, her dark eyes filled with a grim certainty. "The water becomes poison. It will be black with chemicals and choked with mine tailings. It will flow down into Stone Creek, kill the fish, and poison the plants we use for medicine. The animals will sicken and die. Our water, the water Red Clay spoke of, will become a river of death." The full scope of Kincaid's plan settled over Abby with the weight of a shroud. It was not just about a railroad. It was about destroying the lifeblood of the Stone Creek people, to make the land uninhabitable for them. "And Stroud's bullet," she whispered, the pieces clicking into place. "It was a provocation," Mackay said, joining them. His voice was cold with a controlled anger. "He wanted to create an incident. If one of my people had been hurt, if we had retaliated, he would have had his excuse. He would have filled the newspapers with stories of an Apache uprising. The army would have been sent in to remove us, and he would have his railroad and his mine, with no one to stand in his way. He means to erase us from this land." Abby looked at him, at the immense burden he carried. It was not just the safety of his people, but the preservation of their entire way of life. She had heard the whispers among the Apache women before, talk of Mackay's need for a wife, for an heir. She had assumed it was the same pressure any leader faced, the desire for a son to carry on his name. But now, listening to the weight in his voice, she understood it was something far deeper. It was not about a bloodline. It was about a lifeline. It was about having someone to pass the knowledge to, someone to be trained in the stories, the laws, the intricate diplomacy needed to navigate the white man's world. It was a commitment to the future, a promise that the wisdom of the Stone Creek band would not die with him. The weight of that responsibility was immense, and today, Kincaid had made it heavier than ever. A profound silence settled over the small camp. The only sound, the soft sigh of the night wind through the sagebrush. Abby felt a strange kinship with these people. She who had always been alone, her own struggle for a small piece of independence, for a life of her own making, seemed to mirror their larger fight for their very existence. Kincaid's greed was a threat to them all, a dark water rising, and she was caught in its current, an unlikely witness, an accidental ally, her fate now tied to the quiet, honorable man who had promised to see her safely home. The 3 days that followed were a strange interlude, a pocket of quiet collaboration stitched into the rising tension of the territory. Sheriff Whitaker had advised Abby to stay out of dry cedar for a spell. "Let the dust settle," he had said, a phrase that seemed both literal and figurative. with the wagon needing more than a roadside repair. She had little choice but to accept Makai's offer to stay at their temporary camp, a collection of simple wickiups nestled in a small, sheltered cove a few miles from town. It was a decision born of necessity, but it quickly became something else entirely. Her world, once confined to the four walls of Widow May's kitchen and the small dimensions of a sewing box, expanded with every passing hour. Makai became her reluctant teacher. He saw in her the same quiet watchfulness he valued in his own people, and he began to show her the language of the land. He taught her not by lecture, but by example. On a walk to check a rabbit snare, he would stop and point to a series of faint depressions in the dirt. A doe and her fawn passed this way since the sun was high. He would say, "The mother's tracks are deep. She walks with purpose. The fawns are shallow, wandering. He is still learning the way." He showed her how a bent twig could signal the direction of a coyote, how the flight pattern of a hawk could reveal a hidden water source. Abby, a woman who lived by the precise measurements of thread and fabric, found a new kind of literacy in the earth itself. He taught her how to tie knots that would hold fast under strain, but could be released with a single, practiced pull. "This is the knot for a horse's lead," he explained, his large, capable hands moving with slow precision so she could follow. "It must be strong, but it must also be quick to undo if the animal panics. Safety is in the release." His instruction was always practical, rooted in a philosophy of respect and preparedness. One afternoon, he found her staring at the rifle Red Clay had propped against a rock. It was a tool of his world, an object of fear and violence in hers. She had never touched a firearm in her life. Noticing her apprehension, Makai picked it up. His movements were deliberate, devoid of any bravado. "It is a tool, Abby, nothing more," he said, his voice low and steady. "Like your needle or an axe, it is the hand that holds it that gives it purpose." He showed her how to check if it was loaded, how to hold it so the stock rested firmly against her shoulder to absorb the kick, how to aim by aligning the sights. He did not have her fire it. The lesson was not about making her a shooter. It was about stripping away the mystique of the weapon, replacing her fear with a simple, mechanical understanding. It was a lesson in control, a quiet assertion that knowledge was the best defense against the unknown. In return, Abby found her own way to contribute. She had her sewing kit, a small leather roll containing her needles, thimbles, and spools of thread. The children of the small band, curious and shy, would watch her from a distance as she mended a tear in her own skirt with tiny, perfect stitches. Anea, seeing this, brought her a saddle with a seam that had come loose. Abby's hands, so often clumsy in this new world of knots and tracks, were transformed. They moved with a surgeon's grace and confidence, her needle flying, the split leather pulling together in a neat, strong line. Soon, a small group of children gathered around her, their dark eyes wide with fascination. She showed them how to thread a needle, how to make a simple running stitch. Their small, clumsy fingers struggled, but they were eager pupils. She taught them to mend their own clothes, to patch a hole in a leather pouch. It was a small thing, but it was a gift of her own world, a skill of preservation and care. She had also brought the only book she owned, a small, worn Bible she had borrowed from the church. At night, by the low fire, she would painstakingly sound out the words, her finger tracing the lines of text. The Apache children, who had no written language of their own, watched her. One evening, a young girl pointed to the letter E. "What sound does that make?" she asked in hesitant English. Abby began to teach them. She showed them the shapes of the letters, the sounds they made. It was a slow, difficult process, for she was barely a student herself. But in teaching them, she found her own understanding growing. She was sharing the most valuable thing she had, the fragile key to a world of knowledge that she herself longed to unlock. One evening, she took her turn cooking the communal meal. It was a simple pot of beans and bacon, a dish she had made 1,000 times, distracted by a conversation with Anea about the different plants used for dyes. She was heavier with the salt than she intended. She did not realize her mistake until she saw the men's faces as they took their first bites. Red Clay coughed discreetly. Several of the younger men reached for their water skins. Abby's face burned with embarrassment. She watched Mackay, expecting a grimace, a complaint, anything. He simply ate, his expression unchanged. He finished his entire portion without a word. When he was done, he looked across the fire at her. "Salt keeps a man through the dry season," he said, his tone perfectly matter-of-fact. Abby, her embarrassment momentarily forgotten, felt a spark of defiance. She narrowed her eyes at him. "Or it just keeps his heart thirsty," she retorted. A slow smile spread across Mackay's face, a rare and genuine expression that lit up his eyes. He gave a single, appreciative nod. The tension was broken. In that small exchange, a new level of ease was forged between them, a shared moment of humor that was more intimate than any touch. On the third day, Sheriff Whitaker rode into their camp. He came alone, his presence a clear signal that this was not official business. He accepted a cup of coffee and sat with Mackay, Red Clay, and Abby. "The talk in town is getting worse," he said, his voice low. "Kincaid's men are spreading stories. They are saying you are gathering warriors, planning an attack. He is turning the people against you. It is what he does," Mackay said. "He twists the truth until it becomes a weapon. We need more than my word or Miss Hart's." The sheriff continued. "We need evidence that Kincaid cannot buy his way out of... We need proof." The four of them bent over a piece of tanned hide, using a charcoal stick to sketch out a map. Red Clay, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the land, drew the winding path of Stone Creek and its tributaries. Abby, with her seamstress's eye for detail, marked the location of Kincaid's supply depot and the spot where she had seen Stroud. The plan they formed was dangerous, but it was their only chance. They would map the points where Kincaid's men were dumping the mine tailings into the water, documenting how the creek's color changed from clear to a sickening blackish gray. "A map is good," Whitaker said, "but we need more. We need a picture." "I know a man in Tombstone, a photographer. He has one of those new silver plate cameras, an image of that black water, of the dead fish. That is something people will understand. It is hard to argue with a photograph. And we need a witness from the inside," Mackay added. "Someone who works for Kincaid." "Jesus Martinez," Abby said softly. Everyone looked at her. "He is a good man. He works on the railroad crew. His wife bought a dress from me once. He has a family. He hates what Kincaid is doing, but he is afraid of losing his job. He is more afraid of Caleb Stroud," the sheriff said grimly. "But he is a decent man. If we can promise him protection, he might talk." Their course was set, a map, a photograph, and a witness. It was a fragile plan, a delicate web of evidence they had to spin while avoiding the spider at its center. As if summoned by their thoughts, a new and terrible sign of their adversary appeared on the horizon. A plume of thick black smoke began to rise into the clear afternoon sky, miles away in the direction of Dry Cedar. It was too much smoke for a chimney or a campfire. It was the smoke of a structure burning, fast and hot. A young Apache scout who had been watching the town from the ridges rode into camp at a gallop. His horse lathered. "It is Kincaid's lumber yard," he said, breathless. "The one with the new railroad ties. It is all on fire." Mackay stood up, his face a mask of cold fury. He knew instantly what this meant. "They will blame us," Anea whispered, her voice filled with dread. It did not take long for her words to prove true. By evening, another rider brought news from town. Caleb Stroud and his men were riding through the streets of Dry Cedar, telling everyone that Apache raiders had set the fire. They claimed it was the first act of a coming war. The fear that had been simmering in the town was now boiling over. Men were grabbing their rifles, boarding up their windows. The fragile peace of the territory was shattering. Abby felt a wave of despair. Their careful plans seemed so small, so insignificant in the face of Kincaid's ruthless tactics. He did not just want the land. He wanted to poison the very air between people, to turn neighbor against neighbor, to burn away any chance of justice with the fires of hatred and fear. She looked at Mackay, who was staring at the last fading wisps of smoke against the twilight sky. His jaw was set, his hands clenched into fists. He had sought peace, negotiation, and reason. Kincaid had answered with fire and lies. The dry season was over. The storm was coming. The air in the high desert had changed. It was no longer just thin and clean. It now carried a bitter, ashen taste from the smoldering remains of Kincaid's lumber. The fire had been a declaration, a lie written in smoke against the sky for everyone to see. In the quiet of the Apache camp, the mood had shifted from watchful patience to a grim, coiled tension. Mackay knew that Kincaid had seized the narrative, painting his people as aggressors. Time was no longer a river flowing at its own pace. It was a dwindling resource. Each grain of sand falling through the hourglass, marking a step closer to a conflict he had worked so hard to avoid. The hand-drawn map was a start, but it was based on reports and knowledge of the land. Mackay needed to see the dam with his own eyes, to witness the poison as it bled into the creek. He had to know the precise extent of the danger before he could devise a way to fight it. It was a risk. Leaving the relative safety of the main camp would make him a target, but staying put was a slower, more certain kind of defeat. He would not go alone. He looked at Abby, who was quietly organizing her small store of medical herbs and clean cloths. Her face set with a quiet determination he was beginning to recognize. She was their witness, the one person from the town who had seen Stroud's mark. Her presence was a liability, but also a necessity. She had to be kept safe, and the safest place for her now was at his side. "We leave at first light," he said to her, his voice low enough that only she and the nearby red clay could hear. "We will follow the arroyo north. It will shield our approach to the dam." Abby simply nodded, her gaze steady. Her fear was a constant companion, but it no longer ruled her. In the past few days, she had discovered a reserve of strength within herself she had never known. She was a seamstress who now knew how to read the earth and understand the cold mechanics of a rifle. Her world had been torn open, and she was slowly, painstakingly, stitching it back together into a new and unfamiliar shape. They set out as the first pale light washed over the eastern mountains, traveling on foot to make less noise. The arroyo was a deep, sandy scar in the earth, a dry riverbed with steep, rocky walls that rose high on either side. The air within it was still and cool, their footsteps made soft, crunching sounds in the coarse sand. For a time, the only sounds were their own breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the vast, empty sky. Mackay moved with a silent, fluid grace, his eyes constantly scanning the rim of the arroyo above them. Abby followed in his footsteps, trying to emulate his lightness, his awareness. He had taught her that the desert spoke a constant, subtle language, and now she strained to hear it. She noticed the small things, a lizard skittering across a hot rock, the way the shadows clung to the western wall of the gully, the unnatural silence that seemed to have fallen over the land. The feeling of being watched came upon them gradually, a prickling sensation on the back of the neck. It was a shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of the air. Mackay stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted, listening. Abby held her breath. He pointed to a spot high on the eastern rim, a flicker of light. It could have been a piece of mica catching the sun, but it was too sharp, too deliberate. It was the glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. Stroud. Mackay breathed, the name a puff of air. He had led them into a trap. The first shot came a moment later. It was not a stray. The bullet kicked up a plume of sand just a few feet to Abby's left, the crack of the rifle echoing an instant later. The sound was a living thing in the narrow arroyo, bouncing from one wall to the other, a cascade of sharp reports that seemed to come from every direction at once. They were pinned down. Mackay grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a large boulder that had fallen from the canyon wall centuries ago. It offered them a small pocket of safety. Another shot whizzed over their heads, striking the rock with a loud crack and sending stone fragments flying. Stroud had the high ground, a perfect vantage point. They were like fish in a barrel. Abby's heart hammered against her ribs. This was not an accident. This was an execution. Stroud was not trying to scare them. He was trying to kill them. Mackay's face was a mask of intense concentration. He was not looking up at the rim where Stroud was hidden. He was looking at the walls of the arroyo, listening to the echoes die away. Abby suddenly remembered what Red Clay had told her by the fire, about how the canyon walls threw sound, how a bullet could come back for the hunter. Mackay picked up a loose, flat stone from the ground. He glanced at Abby, his eyes conveying a silent instruction: be ready. He drew his arm back and flung the stone with all his might. It sailed through the air and struck the opposite wall of the arroyo, 100 feet downstream from their position, with a loud clatter. The sound of the impact, amplified by the natural acoustics of the gully, was sharp and misleading. Stroud, hearing the noise, fired instantly. The bullet slammed into the rock wall far from where they were hiding. He had fired at an echo. Now, Mackay whispered. He broke from cover, running low and fast, weaving between the scattered boulders that littered the arroyo floor. Abby followed a half-second behind him, her lungs burning, her feet sinking into the soft sand. It was a desperate, mad dash for their lives. Stroud, realizing his mistake, fired again, but they were already moving. A harder target to hit. The bullet whined past Abby's ear, terrifyingly close. They scrambled down the arroyo, the echoing shots chasing them. Mackay was using the land itself as his weapon, his knowledge turning the trap into a maze. Each turn, each bend in the dry riverbed, offered a moment of new cover. He was not just running, he was thinking, calculating, using the very rocks and echoes that should have condemned them as tools for their survival. Finally, they reached a narrow split in the arroyo wall, a place where centuries of flash floods had carved a smaller, twisting channel through the rock. It was barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. Mackay pushed her toward it, and they squeezed into the tight passage, the rough sandstone scraping against their clothes. Here, under the overhang of the rock, they were finally safe from Stroud's rifle. They leaned against the cool stone, gasping for breath, the sound of their own ragged breathing loud in the sudden, ringing silence. They had escaped, but they were now deep in unfamiliar territory. Cut off from their path back to camp, they rested for only a moment before moving on, pushing deeper into the labyrinth of rock and sand. As they emerged from the narrow passage into a wider, sunlit clearing, they saw him. He was a boy, no more than 16, one of the younger members of the band named Tolan. He was lying at the base of a rockfall, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. A dark stain was spreading across the buckskin of his trousers. He had been sent to warn them, to tell them that Stroud had been seen leaving town, heading for the arroyo. He had run with the heedless courage of youth, taking a shortcut over the treacherous rocks, and had been caught in Stroud's line of fire. Mackay was at his side in an instant, his face grim. The boy was conscious, his face pale with pain and shock. "Stroud," he whispered, his voice thin. "He saw me. I tried to shout a warning." Mackay examined the wound. The bullet had gone through the fleshy part of the boy's thigh. It was bleeding badly, pulsing in a steady, alarming rhythm. The boy's life was seeping out into the thirsty sand. Without a word, Abby knelt beside them. She pulled her sewing roll from the small pouch at her waist, but instead of a needle, she took out the small, sharp shears she used for cutting thread. She quickly and efficiently cut away the boy's trouser leg to expose the wound. Then, without a moment of hesitation, she took the hem of her own sturdy cotton petticoat and ripped a long, wide strip of clean cloth. Mackay watched her, a look of profound respect in his eyes. Her hands, which he had seen move with such delicacy over a needle, were now working with a steady, practical purpose. She folded the cloth into a thick pad and pressed it firmly against the wound. "Hold it here," she said to Mackay, her voice calm and level, a small island of authority in the midst of the crisis. "Press down, hard." Mackay covered her hands with his own, applying firm, steady pressure. Their hands, his large and calloused, hers smaller but just as resolute. worked together. In that moment, they were not a chief and a seamstress, not an Apache and a white woman. They were two people, bound by a shared purpose, fighting to save a life. Abby took another strip of cloth and expertly wrapped it around the boy's thigh, binding the pad tightly in place. Mackay then turned his attention to the boy's leg. The bone was broken. He found two straight, sturdy branches from a dead greasewood bush and, using thin strips of leather from his pouch, he carefully splinted the leg, immobilizing the fracture. Then, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his strength, he carefully lifted Tolan into his arms. The boy cried out once, a sharp gasp of pain, and then fell quiet. The journey back was a slow, grueling ordeal. Mackay carried the boy, his steps measured and careful, his face a stoic mask that betrayed none of the effort it cost him. Abby walked ahead, clearing the path, her eyes scanning for any sign of Stroud. The trust between them was absolute, an unspoken bond forged in the heat of crisis. When they finally reached the camp, a somber silence fell over the small community. The sight of the injured boy in Mackay's arms was a visceral blow. This was no longer a distant conflict about land rights and railroad tracks. It had become a war on their children. Mackay's leadership was on full display. There were no cries for vengeance, no wild talk of retaliation. There was only a disciplined, focused effort to care for the wounded boy. He showed his people that their strength was not in rage, but in their compassion and their unity. News of the shooting traveled quickly, but the story that reached Dry Cedar was twisted and warped. Stroud's version, the one told in the saloon over whiskey, was that he had been fired upon by Apache warriors and had only returned fire in self-defense. The town, already primed by the lumberyard fire, began to split apart. On one side were the merchants and businessmen who saw Kincaid's railroad as the lifeblood of their prosperity. To them, progress was worth any cost. Protecting the railroad meant protecting civilization itself. On the other side were a few lone voices, farmers and ranchers who understood the importance of clean water, people like Widow May who saw the injustice for what it was. To them, protecting the canyon was about protecting life itself. The town was a powder keg, and Kincaid, through Stroud, had just lit the fuse. The final blow came that evening, delivered by a grim-faced Sheriff Whitaker. He had ridden hard from the county seat. Kincaid has made his move, he told Mackay, his voice heavy. He has bought the court clerk. The hearing on the Stone Creek land claim has been moved up. It is scheduled for the end of this week. He is going to steal your land with a piece of paper before you even have a chance to present your case. The news landed like a physical weight. They had only days to get the photograph from Tombstone, to convince Jesus Martinez to testify, to prepare any kind of legal defense. Stroud's ambush in the arroyo had not just been an attempt on their lives. It had been a tactic to delay them, to keep them occupied while Kincaid cut the ground out from under them in a courtroom miles away. They had survived the bullets, but now they faced an enemy far more insidious, a corrupt and hurried justice, where honor was for sale and the truth was whatever a man like Silas Kincaid decided it should be. Kincaid's next attack came not with a bullet, but with ink and paper. It was quieter, more insidious, and in many ways, far more cruel. The weapon was a single sheet of cheap newsprint, the front page of the Dry Cedar Chronicle, a paper whose journalistic integrity was as flimsy as the material it was printed on. Silas Kincaid owned the press, and he had just loaded it with his most poisonous ammunition yet. Anea brought the news. She had gone into town under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom to purchase some supplies and to listen, her keen ears sifting through the fearful gossip for any grains of useful information. She returned not with salt and coffee, but with a folded newspaper held in her hand as if it were a venomous snake. Her face, usually so expressive, was a cold, hard mask of fury. She walked directly to where Mackay and Abby were checking the poultice on Tolan's wound. Without a word, she unfolded the paper and laid it on a flat rock for them to see. The ink was black and bold, the headline sprawling across the top of the page in enormous, sensational letters designed to be read from across a dusty street. It was a masterpiece of slander, a story crafted to twist every fact, to curdle every good intention into something ugly and sordid. The Apache chief needed an heir. The shy virgin was his surprise choice and his forever love. The words seemed to leap off the page, striking Abby with the force of a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face, replaced by a hot, sickening wave of shame. Her breath caught in her throat. She read the smaller text below, a vile and speculative narrative that took the simple facts of their encounter, the runaway wagon, her presence at their camp, and wove them into a lurid tale of a savage chief taking a lonely, desperate white woman for his pleasure. It painted her as a willing participant in a scandalous affair, a woman of loose morals hiding behind a shy demeanor. It insinuated that her virtue was the price for her safety, the currency of her continued existence. Every word was a violation. Her privacy, her quiet dignity, the very core of her identity as a decent, hard-working woman, had been stripped from her and put on public display, twisted into a grotesque caricature for the amusement and judgment of the entire town. She felt naked, exposed, her name and her character dragged through the filth of Kincaid's lies, the careful, ordered world she had built for herself. A world where her reputation was her only real possession, had been burned to the ground just as surely as Kincaid's lumberyard. She backed away from the newspaper as if it were on fire, her hands flying to her mouth. A choked, strangled sound escaped her lips. She could feel the eyes of the entire camp on her, though she knew they were looks of sympathy, not condemnation. But in her mind, she saw the faces of the people in Dry Cedar, Widow May, the church ladies, the men in the saloon. She could hear their whispers, their snide remarks, their righteous condemnation. She, Abigail Hart, the quiet seamstress, was now the town scandal. "I have to go," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. She turned, her only instinct to run, to flee from the humiliation, to disappear back into the anonymity she had cherished. "I have brought this shame on you. I have to leave." Mackay's hand closed gently but firmly around her arm, stopping her. His touch was not possessive, but grounding, an anchor in the swirling storm of her despair. She would not look at him, her eyes fixed on the ground, hot tears of shame and rage blurring her vision. "This is not your shame, Abby," he said, his voice calm and steady amidst her turmoil. "This is Kincaid's. This paper is his weapon. It is meant to divide us. It is meant to drive you away. If you run, he wins. I cannot face them," she choked out. "I cannot bear their looks, their whispers." "Look at me," he said, his voice soft but insistent. She slowly, reluctantly, raised her head. His dark eyes were not filled with pity, but with a fierce, unwavering belief. "Honor is not answered with words on a page," he said. "It is answered by our deeds. We will answer this lie not by running, but by standing our ground and finishing what we started." His certainty was a rock she could cling to, but the wound was too fresh, the humiliation too raw. She pulled her arm free and fled to the small, borrowed wickiup that had been her shelter, the vile words of the headline burning behind her eyes. Later that morning, Sheriff Whitaker rode his weary gelding down the main street of Dry Cedar. He saw it immediately. A fresh copy of the Chronicle was nailed to the post outside the saloon, another to the wall of the general store. A small crowd was gathered around the one on the post, men reading the headline aloud, their voices a low mixture of shock and crude amusement. The sheriff's face, already etched with the lines of worry, hardened into a granite mask. He swung down from his horse, his movement stiff with anger. He walked to the post, his boots heavy in the dust. The men fell silent as he approached, their smirks fading under his cold, furious gaze. Without a word, he reached up, tore the newspaper from the post with a single, violent motion, and crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist. He strode over to the general store and did the same, the ripping sound of the paper a small, satisfying punctuation to his rage. He turned to face the silent, watching crowd. "Go home," he said, his voice a low growl that carried the full weight of his authority. "You have better things to do than gawk at lies meant to stir up trouble." The crowd dispersed, but not before he saw the looks on their faces. The poison had already taken root. The whispers would continue. The damage was done. Silas Kincaid had played his hand brilliantly, turning a story of survival and unlikely alliance into a cheap scandal, further isolating the Apache and discrediting his only white witness in a single, masterful stroke. The sky, which had been a clear and unforgiving blue, began to cloud over in the late afternoon. A cool wind kicked up, carrying the scent of rain. The clouds thickened, turning a bruised purplish gray, and a low rumble of thunder echoed from the distant mountains. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering in the dust and leaving dark circles that quickly multiplied and bled together. Mackay had been tracking a deer, teaching two of the younger boys the finer points of reading the signs. When the storm broke, Abby, needing to escape the suffocating confines of the camp and her own thoughts, had been walking along the creek bed, gathering the smooth, flat stones she found so beautiful. The rain came suddenly, a drenching downpour that soaked them both to the skin in a matter of moments. They were a mile from the main camp. Mackay spotted it first, a small, dark opening in the side of a rock face, a shallow cave or an old hunter's shelter. "Come," he shouted over the growing roar of the rain. "We can wait it out in there." The shelter was small and dry, the air inside cool and smelling of dust and old stone. The opening looked out on the storm, a gray, slanting sheet of rain that blurred the landscape and turned the world outside into a watercolor painting. The sound of the downpour was a constant, drumming roar, isolating them from everything else, cocooning them in the small, dark space. They sat in a companionable silence for a time, listening to the rhythm of the storm. The raw wound of the morning's humiliation was still fresh for Abby, and she hugged her knees to her chest, a defensive posture against a world that had suddenly turned hostile. Mackay finally broke the silence, his voice quiet and thoughtful, barely rising above the sound of the rain. "The headline," he said, "it was clever. It used our own ways against us." Abby looked at him, confused. "What do you mean, the need for an heir?" He explained, his gaze fixed on the rain-swept world outside. "Kincaid and his people, they think of it in terms of blood, a son to inherit a name, a fortune, a kingdom. They do not understand. For us, an heir is a vessel for knowledge, a mind to hold the stories, the laws, the ways of our people, the one who will carry our voice forward when my own is gone." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and serious in the gloom of the shelter. "I am the last in my direct line who has been trained in the old ways and also understands the new. My uncle, Red Clay, he holds the past, but I must negotiate the future. If I fall, and there is no one who knows what I know, who can speak to your people and also hold true to ours, then our voice is lost. The Stone Creek Band will be scattered, absorbed. We will cease to be. That is the fear I carry. It is not about a son. It is about survival." He had given her a gift, a piece of his deepest vulnerability. He was entrusting her with the truth, stripping away the lie of the newspaper to show her the heavy burden beneath. The generosity of his trust made a space for her own. "I have never really had a home," she said, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the storm. "After my father died, it was just places. The orphanage, then a room at the boarding house, then my corner in Widow May's kitchen. Places to sleep, places to work, but not a home." She looked at her hands, the hands of a seamstress, calloused and capable. "I always thought a home was something you built with wood and nails, like the town, a place to keep you safe from the outside. But it is not, is it? It is a feeling, a place where you are seen, where you do not have to hide or be ashamed of who you are." She finally looked at him, her eyes clear and honest. "Being here with your people, these last few days, it is the first time I have ever felt like I might be building something real. Not just a wall against the world, but a place to truly live. The newspaper, it felt like they were trying to burn that down before the first wall was even raised." Mackay moved closer, the space between them shrinking until their knees were almost touching. He reached out, not to embrace her, but simply to take her hand, His fingers were warm and strong, closing around hers. It was a simple, profound touch, a silent acknowledgement of the truths they had just shared. "When this is over, Abby," he said, his voice a low, steady promise against the backdrop of the storm. "When the water is clear again and our land is safe, I will ask you to build that home with me. I will ask you to be my wife." It was not a passionate declaration fueled by the heat of the moment. It was a statement of fact, a promise of a future forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. It was a commitment as solid and enduring as the stone that sheltered them. Tears welled in Abby's eyes, but they were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of a profound and startling hope. She tightened her grip on his hand, her answer a silent pressure, a vow of her own. "Yes," she whispered, the single word a quiet testament to the house they would build together, a home founded not on land or blood, but on the simple, unshakable truth of being seen for who they truly were. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the air, but inside the small stone shelter, the world felt clean and new and full of promise. The promise made in the stone shelter was a fragile seed planted in the heart of a storm. Outside, the rain that had been a steady drumming became a deafening roar. The wind howled through the canyons, tearing at the scrub and whipping the water into a frenzy. This was no longer a simple summer storm. It was the sky opening up, a deluge that the parched land could not absorb. The promise of life that rain brought to the desert was being overwhelmed by its raw, destructive power. Mackay stood at the entrance of the small cave, his hand resting on the stone, his gaze fixed on the churning chaos outside. Abby stood beside him, the warmth of their clasped hands a small, defiant point of stillness in the maelstrom. She could see the worry etched on his face, a deep concern that went beyond the immediate danger of the storm. "The dam," he said, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost in the noise. It was not built to hold against this. He had spoken her own fear aloud. Kincaid's dam was a hasty, careless thing, a structure of raw earth and green logs, built for profit, not permanence. It was a scar on the land, holding back not just water but a toxic brew of mining waste. Now, the full fury of the sky was beating against it. They heard it before they saw it. A low, guttural groan vibrated through the rock beneath their feet, a sound of immense pressure and imminent failure. It was followed by a splintering crack that sounded like the world's largest tree being snapped in two. And then, the roar. It was a new sound, deeper and more terrifying than the storm itself. It was the sound of a river unleashed, a hungry, angry beast breaking its chains. A wall of water came surging down the canyon, but it was not the honest, muddy brown of a natural flash flood. It was a churning torrent of thick, oily black sludge. It moved with an unnatural, sickening viscosity, carrying on its crest a horrifying debris of uprooted trees, dead animals, and the pale silver bellies of countless poisoned fish. The stench hit them a moment later, a chemical reek of sulfur and crushed rock that burned the back of the throat. Kincaid's poison was free. Mackay reacted instantly, his voice cutting through the din. "Higher ground," he yelled to the few members of his band who had been caught out in the storm with them. His command was absolute, his presence a beacon of calm authority in the panic. He guided them up the slick rock face, his strong hands finding holds, his voice encouraging them, ensuring no one was left behind. Abby's mind raced. The plan, the evidence, the photograph. The camera was back at the main camp, wrapped in oilcloth, but this monstrous, undeniable truth flowing past them, this was the image they needed. Then she remembered. The photographer in Tombstone, when explaining how the silver plates worked, had given her a spare, smaller one, a test plate. He had called it. She had tucked it into her sewing pouch, a curiosity, a small square of polished silver coated in chemicals. She pulled it from her pouch now, her hands trembling. It was not a camera, but it was light-sensitive. If she could expose it, even for a moment, it might capture something. A shadow, a silhouette, the stark contrast of the black water against the gray sky. "Wait!" she cried, her voice thin against the flood's roar. She braced herself against the rock wall, holding the small silver plate out. She removed the simple leather flap that protected it, pointing it toward the terrible river. She had no idea how long to expose it, no knowledge of the science behind it. She could only hold it steady, the rain beating on her face and hands, and pray. She counted to 10, her heart pounding in time with each number, and then covered the plate again, tucking it safely back into her pouch. It was a desperate gamble, a seamstress trying her hand at alchemy, but it was all she could do. As the main crest of the flood passed, leaving a river of black sludge where a clear creek had once been, Mackay waded into the foul, ankle-deep water. He ignored the dead fish and the chemical smell. His eyes were scanning the sediment, the unnatural debris left behind by the torrent. He bent down and picked something up. It was a heavy, blackened stone, laced with a dull, metallic vein, ore. The physical proof of Kincaid's illegal mining operation, washed down from the dam and delivered to their very feet. He had the proof in his hand. Abby, hopefully, had the proof in her pouch. The news of the flood reached Dry Cedar not by a rider, but by the flood itself. The black water, thick and foul, surged into the lower parts of the town, filling the main street with a stinking, ankle-deep mire littered with dead fish. The people came out of their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. This was not some distant problem in an Apache canyon anymore. Kincaid's poison was now lapping at their own doorsteps. A crowd began to form near the train depot, the symbol of Kincaid's power. They were angry and confused, their fear a volatile substance looking for a spark. Caleb Stroud was there, of course, with a handful of his hired guns. He moved through the crowd, his voice loud and confident, spinning his lies. It was the Apache, he shouted, pointing a finger toward the hills. They sabotaged the dam. They are trying to poison our town, drive us out. This is an act of war. Some in the crowd, already steeped in fear and prejudice, began to murmur their agreement. Others looked at the foul water, at the dead fish, and a seed of doubt began to sprout. This did not look like the work of men who lived off the land. This looked like the waste of industry, the carelessness of greed. Into this tense, volatile scene, Mackay walked. He came not as a warrior, but as a leader. He was flanked only by Red Clay and Anea. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, his moccasins silent in the sludge. In one hand, he carried one of the blackened, heavy stones. In the other, he held up a single, large trout, its silver scales coated in the black slime, its eyes a milky, vacant white. He stopped in the center of the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople before finally settling on Caleb Stroud. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. "This is your work, Stroud," Mackay said, his voice not loud, but clear and carrying, cutting through the tension. "This poison comes from Kincaid's mine. You have fouled our water. Now you have fouled your own." Stroud laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You have got no proof, just the word of a savage against a white man. Now get out of this town before my men decide to teach you some manners." "This is not about manners," Mackay replied, his voice still level, still controlled. "This is about truth, and it is about the lives you have endangered, both mine and yours. But your men will not solve this. This is between you and me." A murmur went through the crowd. Stroud's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" he snarled. "I am saying that this anger, this fear you have stirred up, it needs a release before it consumes this whole town," Mackay said, dropping the stone and the fish at his feet. "You and I, here and now, no guns, no knives, just fists. The winner speaks his truth. The loser walks away." It was a brilliant move, a challenge Stroud could not refuse without looking like a coward in front of the very men he sought to lead. It was a way to channel the mob's brewing violence, to focus it on two men instead of letting it explode into a bloody riot. Stroud grinned, cracking his knuckles. He was a bigger man than Mackay, broader in the shoulder, his strength that of a barroom brawler. He saw an easy victory. "Fine by me," he said. "I have always wanted to shut your mouth for good. They circled each other in the muddy street, a ring of silent townspeople forming around them. The fight was brutal and short. Stroud came in swinging, his punches wild and powerful. Mackay was faster, more agile. He moved like a dancer, ducking under Stroud's clumsy blows, landing sharp, precise jabs that snapped Stroud's head back. Stroud was a blunt instrument. Mackay was a finely honed blade, frustrated and bleeding from a cut on his lip. Stroud lunged, trying to wrestle Mackay to the ground. Mackay sidestepped, using Stroud's own momentum against him, and sent him sprawling into the black sludge. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Stroud, humiliated and enraged, scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pure fury. The fight was lost, and he knew it. And in that moment, his true nature revealed itself. His hand darted to the boot sheathed at his ankle. The flash of polished steel was unmistakable as he drew a long, wicked-looking knife. He lunged at Mackay, no longer a fighter, but an assassin. Some of the women in the crowd screamed. Before anyone else could react, a single gunshot exploded through the air, deafeningly loud. It was not Stroud's gun. The bullet whizzed past Stroud's head and buried itself in the wooden wall of the depot, inches from his ear. The entire street froze. Sheriff Tom Whitaker stood on the boardwalk, a smoking pistol in his hand, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury. "That is enough," he roared, his voice the unquestionable sound of the law. Stroud stopped, his chest heaving, the knife still clutched in his hand. The spell of his intimidation was broken. The townspeople were no longer looking at Mackay as an enemy. They were looking at Stroud, at the knife in his hand, and they were seeing him for what he was: a coward, a cheat, a man who would bring a blade to a fist fight. The tide of their belief, so carefully manipulated by Kincaid, had just turned. In that frozen moment of shocked silence, tragedy struck. The sheriff's gunshot, a sound of order, had an unintended consequence. A team of horses harnessed to a freight wagon, spooked by the loud report, suddenly bolted. The wagon careened down the street, directly toward a small cluster of people, including a young boy who had been pushed forward by the surging crowd and now stood frozen in terror in the wagon's path. Red Clay, who had been standing nearest the child, moved with the speed of a striking hawk. He did not hesitate. He lunged, shoving the boy with all his might, pushing him clear of the thundering hooves. The child stumbled and fell safely into the mud, but Red Clay, his momentum carrying him forward, was not so lucky. The heavy wooden axle of the wagon caught him in the side, tossing him through the air like a rag doll. He landed in a crumpled heap on the boardwalk, a deathly silence falling over the street as the runaway horses galloped into the distance. The fight was forgotten. Mackay was at his uncle's side in an instant, cradling the old man's head in his lap. Anea knelt beside them, her face a portrait of anguish. Abby pushed through the stunned crowd, her medical cloths in hand. But one look at Red Clay's still form told her it was too late. The light was already fading from his eyes. Red Clay's hand, thin and frail, reached up and gripped Mackay's arm. "The fire," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "It is not passed by blood alone. Mackay, an heir, is not just a son. It is a promise. It is the one who carries the knowledge and shares it." His gaze drifted past Mackay, his eyes finding Abby where she knelt in the mud. "The seamstress," he rasped, a faint smile touching his lips. "She has the eyes that see the truth, the hands that mend what is broken. She is a keeper of knowledge now. Two, you must be keepers together." He looked back at his nephew, his grip tightening for a final moment. "Do not let the fire go out, Mackay." With a final, gentle sigh, the last of the life left him. The keeper of the stories was gone. A profound, sorrowful silence descended upon the street. The rain began to fall again, a soft, cleansing drizzle, washing the mud and the blood from the boardwalk. But it could not wash away the loss. The townspeople stood in stunned, somber witness, their petty squabbles and manufactured hatreds forgotten in the face of a true and noble sacrifice. Mackay had won his fight and exposed his enemy, but the cost had been immeasurable. He was left with his victory, his evidence, and his grief, holding the body of his beloved uncle as the gentle rain fell on them both. The definition of his life's most sacred duty, the meaning of an heir, had just been rewritten in the blood of the man who had taught it to him. Grief is a heavy blanket, and it settled over the Stone Creek camp with a silence that was more profound than any wail of sorrow. Red Clay was gone. His stories were now memories, his wisdom an echo. But his last words had not been of despair. They had been a charge, a passing of a torch. In the somber days that followed, Mackay's grief hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He was no longer just a leader trying to negotiate a peace. He was the keeper of a fire, a man with a promise to fulfill, and Silas Kincaid was the bitter wind trying to extinguish it. The town of Dry Cedar was also transformed. The sight of Red Clay's sacrifice and Stroud's craven cowardice had been a bucket of cold water on the fevered fears Kincaid had stoked. The black sludge that still coated the low-lying areas of town was a constant, stinking testament to who the real enemy was. The battle lines were no longer drawn between white and Apache, but between the people of the territory and the singular, all-consuming greed of one man. Their small alliance, forged in crisis, now moved with a quiet, desperate urgency. The hastily scheduled court hearing loomed, a legal ambush designed to finalize the theft of Stone Creek Canyon. Sheriff Whitaker, his face grimmer than ever, took the lead on the legal front. There is only one person in this territory who has the sand to face Kincaid in a courtroom and who cannot be bought, he announced one evening, as he, Mackay, and Abby sat around a low fire. Her name is Eleanor Pike. The next day, they traveled to the county seat, a larger, more established town with a proper courthouse. Miss Eleanor Pike's office was not the grand, wood-paneled affair of a successful lawyer. It was a single, cluttered room at the back of a dressmaker's shop, filled with stacks of books and legal papers that threatened to overwhelm the small space. Miss Pike herself was a woman in her late 40s, with hair the color of steel pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that were as sharp and discerning as a hawk's. She wore a simple, practical dress and no-nonsense spectacles. She listened to their story without interruption, her gaze moving from the sheriff's earnest face to Mackay's stoic dignity, to Abby's quiet intensity. When they had finished, she sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. A railroad baron, a corrupt court clerk, a hired gunman, and a campaign of lies. She summarized, her voice dry and devoid of emotion. And what, precisely, is your evidence one by one? They laid their meager proofs on her crowded desk. First, the hand-drawn map detailing the creek, the dam, and the illegal dumping sites. Miss Pike examined it with a critical eye, nodding slightly. Then, Mackay placed the blackened piece of ore on a stack of papers. Tangible, she murmured. Good. Sheriff Whitaker presented his report on the lumberyard fire, noting that the fire had started in 3 separate places at once, a clear sign of arson, not an accidental raid. He also gave his official account of the confrontation at the depot, officially naming Caleb Stroud as the man who had drawn a knife in a fist fight. Then, it was Abby's turn. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the small silver plate from her pouch. It was wrapped in layers of clean, dark cloth. She had not looked at it since the flood, terrified that her desperate gamble had resulted in nothing more than a ruined piece of metal. It is not a proper photograph, she explained, her voice barely a whisper. I just held it up. I do not even know if there is anything on it. Miss Pike took the plate, her movements careful. She carried it over to the window, angling it to catch the light. For a long moment, she was silent. The plate was a mess of chemical streaks and water spots. But in the center, a ghostly image was undeniably present. It was a dark, spectral silhouette of the opposite canyon wall, and flowing before it was a stark, black shape, a river of poison captured in silver. It was a haunting, abstract image, but it was also a damning one. It is a chemical shadow, Miss Pike said, her voice holding a new note of respect. But it is a shadow with a story to tell. It corroborates the timeline. She looked at Abby, a flicker of admiration in her sharp eyes. Very resourceful. Miss Hart, finally. They told her of their last witness. The next morning, Sheriff Whitaker brought a nervous but resolute Jesus Martinez to Miss Pike's office. The man's hands were calloused from his work on the railroad, and his eyes were full of fear, but also a quiet courage. He had seen what happened to Red Clay. He had a son the same age as the boy the old Apache had saved. His conscience would no longer let him remain silent. He told Miss Pike everything he knew about the secret construction of the dam, about the orders to dump the mine tailings directly into the creek at night, about the threats Stroud had made to any worker who dared to speak a word of it. Miss Pike listened to it all, her expression unreadable. When Jesus had finished, she gave a single, decisive nod. Mr. Kincaid has been allowed to operate in the shadows for too long. She said, "It is time we shone a light on him. I will take the case." The day of the hearing, the air in the town was thick with a palpable tension. The courthouse was a simple wooden building, but on this day, it felt like the center of the universe. Silas Kincaid was already there, holding court on the top step. He was impeccably dressed in a fine Eastern suit, looking every bit the captain of industry, a harbinger of civilization in this dusty wilderness. He smiled and shook hands, exuding an aura of untouchable confidence. Caleb Stroud stood a few feet behind him, his arms crossed, a smug, menacing sneer on his face. He had been released on his own recognizance, a testament to Kincaid's influence. Kincaid had also brought an audience. A rough-looking crowd of men, mostly railroad workers and saloon loafers who had been well paid for their time, milled about on the courthouse lawn. They were loud and boisterous, their presence a clear attempt to intimidate and to create the illusion of popular support for Kincaid. When Mackay, Abby, and their small party arrived, a wave of jeers and catcalls rose from the hired crowd. Abby flinched, instinctively wanting to shrink back, but Mackay placed a steadying hand on the small of her back, and Anea walked protectively at her other side. They walked through the gauntlet of hostility with their heads held high, their silence a more powerful statement than any shouted insult. Inside, the courtroom was packed and suffocatingly hot. The judge was a man with a weak chin and eyes that constantly darted toward Silas Kincaid. The prosecuting attorney, a man named Henderson, was slick and well-fed, his smile oily. The proceedings began, a dry recitation of legal claims. Henderson, representing the interests of the railroad, painted a picture of progress and prosperity, of a vital artery of commerce being threatened by a small band of recalcitrant natives who refused to accept the inevitable march of progress. Then, Miss Eleanor Pike began to present their case. She was a marvel of calm, methodical precision. She presented the map, the ore sample, Jesus Martinez's testimony. With each piece of evidence, a small crack appeared in Kincaid's confident facade. Henderson's objections were frequent, but Miss Pike swatted them away with sharp, irrefutable points of law. Finally, she called her last witness, Abigail Hart. Abby's heart pounded as she walked to the witness stand. The room was a blur of faces. She focused on Mackay, who gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. She swore the oath, her voice thin but clear. Henderson approached her for his cross-examination, circling her like a predator. His questions began simply, establishing who she was, a seamstress, a kitchen hand. Then, his tone turned condescending, dripping with disdain. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "is it true that you have had very little formal schooling, that your ability to read and write is limited?" Objection, Miss Pike said sharply. "Counsel is attempting to bully the witness." Overruled, the judge said, avoiding Miss Pike's gaze. "The witness will answer the question." Abby felt a hot flush of her old shame rise in her cheeks. This was Kincaid's tactic, to discredit her by painting her as an ignorant, unreliable simpleton. For a moment, she faltered. All her life, she had been made to feel small because of what she did not know. She looked at Henderson's smug face. Then she thought of Red Clay's dying words, of the trust Mackay had placed in her, of the ugly black water that had poisoned the creek. And in that moment, the shame was burned away by a clean, bright flame of indignation. She was no longer the timid girl who hid in the kitchens. She was a keeper of knowledge. She was a witness to the truth. She lifted her chin and met Henderson's gaze directly. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled the courtroom with its simple, unshakable conviction. "I can read well enough to see black water," she said clearly, "and I can write well enough to sign my name to a testimony I believe in." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Henderson was momentarily speechless. His condescending smirk wiped from his face. A low murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. In 2 simple sentences, Abby had claimed her own authority. An authority based not on education, but on conscience and clear-eyed observation. She had turned his insult into a declaration of her own unique and powerful literacy. The hearing was adjourned for the day, the judge clearly flustered. As Abby and her friends exited the courthouse, they stepped back into the hostile atmosphere of Kincaid's hired mob. The men were angrier now, their mood uglier. As Abby descended the steps, Caleb Stroud moved to intercept her, blocking her path. His eyes were cold with hatred. "You think you are clever, don't you, little seamstress?" he snarled, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "You better watch your step. It is a long, dark walk back to that camp of yours. Accidents happen." Before Abby could even react, Mackay was there. He moved with a silent, deadly speed, placing himself between her and Stroud. He did not touch the man. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, a wall of implacable strength, and the sheer force of his presence was more intimidating than any physical threat. "You touch her," Mackay said, his voice low and cold as a winter creek. "And you touch all of Stone Creek." Stroud hesitated, looking from Mackay's unyielding face to the crowd of Apache who had gathered silently behind their leader. He saw not a small, frightened band, but a unified people, their faces set and resolute. He had threatened one woman, but he was now facing an entire nation. He held Mackay's gaze for a long moment. Then, with a curse, he backed away, melting back into the crowd. The immediate danger had passed, but the air was electric with the promise of a coming storm. The battle had been joined in the courtroom, but they all knew it would not end there. The night before the final day of the hearing was a held breath. The air, washed clean by the storm, was still and cool, but it carried no sense of peace. In the small, temporary camp they had established just beyond the town limits, a fire burned low, its embers glowing like watchful eyes in the darkness. No one spoke much. The legal arguments had been made, the evidence presented. All that was left was the waiting, and the waiting was a kind of torment. Mackay sat sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a steady, meditative sound in the quiet. The motion was practical, but it was also a way of channeling his coiled energy, his grief, his fierce determination. Abby sat nearby, her sewing kit open on her lap. She was not mending anything. She was simply organizing her needles and spools of thread. The familiar, orderly task, a small comfort in a world that felt chaotic and uncertain. Their shared silence was not empty. It was filled with the promise they had made in the stone shelter, a quiet foundation that held them steady against the coming day. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a smell, a sharp, acrid scent of wood smoke, too thick and too close to be a chimney. Then came the light, a flickering, malevolent orange that danced against the distant buildings, painting the underside of the clouds in a hellish glow. A frantic shout cut through the night, a woman's voice, high with panic. "Fire!" Abby's head snapped up, her heart seizing in her chest. The direction. The light was coming from the center of town, from the area behind the dressmaker's shop. "From Miss Pike's office. The evidence." She breathed, the words a knot of ice in her stomach. Mackay was already on his feet, the knife and stone forgotten. In an instant, they were running, their quiet camp exploding into urgent motion. They raced toward the town. the orange glow growing brighter, the smell of smoke thicker with every step. The fire was not in Miss Pike's office itself, but in the small wooden storage shed directly behind it. The shed where, for lack of space and for safekeeping, the lawyer had stored the box containing all their precious, irreplaceable evidence. The map, Jesus' sworn affidavit, the blackened ore sample, and Abby's silver plate. A small crowd had gathered, their faces lit by the hungry flames that were now licking up the side of the shed. The volunteer fire brigade was a disorganized mess, shouting and fumbling with buckets. They were too late. The shed was an inferno. "It is all gone," Sheriff Whitaker said, his voice ragged as he appeared at their side. "Stroud must have done this, to destroy everything before the judge can rule." "No." Abby's voice was firm, resolute. She pointed to a small, barred window on the side of the shed, still untouched by the main blaze. Miss Pike kept the box just under that window. On a low shelf, there might be a chance. Before anyone could stop her, she darted toward the building. Mackay was right behind her. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that seared the skin and stole the breath. The roar of the fire was a living thing. "Stay back," Mackay commanded, pushing her behind him. He ripped a charred plank from the side of the building, ignoring the splinters and the heat, and used it as a battering ram against the shed's flimsy door. The wood groaned and splintered. On the third blow, the lock gave way, and the door flew inward, releasing a belch of thick, black smoke. Inside, the flames were everywhere. A section of the roof was already collapsing, sending a shower of sparks and burning embers down into the chaos. But through the smoke, Abby could see it, the small wooden box, sitting on its low shelf, the wood already beginning to blacken and smolder. Mackay soaked a rag from a nearby water barrel and tied it around Abby's face. "I will go," he said. "No," she insisted, her eyes meeting his over the cloth. "I know exactly where it is. You hold the way open." It was a testament to the trust between them that he did not argue. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He took a deep breath and plunged into the doorway, using his body to shield the opening, beating back the flames with a heavy plank. Abby followed, her world shrinking to a single, desperate purpose. The smoke was a choking, blinding fog. The heat was unbearable. She scrambled over burning debris, her eyes fixed on the box. She reached it, her fingers closing around the hot wood. As she pulled it from the shelf, a flaming roof beam crashed down just behind her, showering her with sparks. She cried out, stumbling backward. Mackay was there in an instant. He grabbed the box from her with one hand and her arm with the other, pulling her out of the inferno and back into the cool night air, just as the rest of the roof collapsed with a deafening roar. They lay on the ground, gasping, coughing, their faces black with soot, but they were safe, and clutched in Mackay's hands was the box. They had won. A single sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the night. The bullet slammed into the dirt just inches from Abby's head. Panic erupted in the crowd. People screamed and scattered. From the darkness of the alleyway across the street, a second shot rang out. This one splintered the corner of the box Mackay was holding. Caleb Stroud. He had not just set the fire to destroy the evidence, he had waited, using the chaos as a cover for an assassination. Mackay shoved Abby behind the meager cover of a water trough, shielding her body with his own. They were trapped, exposed. Stroud was hidden in the shadows, a hunter picking his targets at will. Abby's mind, sharp and clear despite the terror, raced. The alleyway, it was narrow, with tall brick buildings on either side. It was a man-made canyon. She remembered Mackay's lesson. She remembered Red Clay's words. The rock throws a sound back. Her eyes darted around, searching. Her gaze fell on a pile of discarded bottles next to the saloon's back door. It was a desperate, insane idea, but it was the only one she had. "The echo," she whispered to Mackay, her voice urgent. He looked at her, and in the flickering firelight, he understood. He gave a single, sharp nod. "On my count," he said, his voice low. 3. He rose slightly, drawing Stroud's attention. A deliberate target, 2. Abby grabbed a thick green bottle from the pile. 1. Mackay dropped back into cover. In the same motion, Abby drew her arm back and threw the bottle with all her strength. It sailed through the air and shattered against the far wall of the alley, 100 feet from where Stroud was hiding. The sound of the breaking glass was sharp and loud, a perfect, misleading crack. In the echoing confines of the alley, it was impossible to tell where it had come from. Stroud, his nerves frayed, his judgment clouded by rage, fired instinctively at the sound. The muzzle flash from his rifle betrayed his position. A brief, bright flower of light in the darkness. Now, a new voice roared, a voice of authority. It was Sheriff Whitaker. He had been flanking the alley, using the chaos to move into position. He and 2 deputies burst from the shadows, their pistols drawn. "Drop it, Stroud," the sheriff commanded. Caught by surprise, his rifle aimed at a phantom sound. Stroud hesitated for a fatal second. It was all the sheriff needed. He lunged, bringing the butt of his pistol down hard on Stroud's wrist. The rifle clattered to the ground. Before Stroud could recover, the deputies had him pinned, the cold, hard steel of handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. The whole thing had happened in a matter of seconds. The townspeople, who had been cowering in fear, slowly emerged from their hiding places. They saw it all. They saw the burning shed. They saw the bullet holes in the dirt. They saw Caleb Stroud, Kincaid's enforcer, standing in handcuffs, his face a mask of thwarted hatred. They saw the truth, not as a story told in a newspaper, but as a raw, undeniable fact, illuminated by the dying flames of his own violent act. The next morning, the mood in the courtroom was electric. There was no hired mob on the lawn, only a silent, watchful crowd of ordinary citizens. Inside, Silas Kincaid sat alone, his usual aura of confident power replaced by a pale, brittle stiffness. The judge on the bench looked nervous, his eyes avoiding Kincaid's completely. Miss Eleanor Pike was a force of nature. She called Jesus Martinez to the stand, the railroad worker, his fear now replaced by a quiet dignity, told the court in a clear, steady voice about the illegal dumping, about the secret orders, about the threats. He was the voice of every honest working man Kincaid had ever exploited. Then, Miss Pike presented the evidence they had rescued from the fire. She held up Abby's crude silver plate. "This," she said to the judge, "is a shadow of the truth, captured on the day the poison was unleashed. And this," she said, producing a new, professionally developed photograph, "is the truth in the full light of day, taken yesterday morning." She placed the 2 images side by side. The first, a ghostly premonition of disaster. The second, a sharp, clear photograph of the dead fish and the black, stinking water that now filled Stone Creek, the before and the after, the crime and its consequence. For her final move, she presented a bank ledger, legally obtained from the Territorial Bank. It clearly showed a large, unexplained wire transfer from one of Silas Kincaid's holding companies to the personal account of the county court clerk. Dated 2 days after the hearing was originally moved up, it was the final, irrefutable proof of corruption. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Silas Kincaid's face, which had been pale, now turned a deep, blotchy red. He rose from his chair, his mask of civility finally shattering. "This is an outrage," he bellowed. "A conspiracy. Sit down, Mr. Kincaid," the judge snapped, his voice shaking but firm. He had been exposed, and his only path now was to salvage what little was left of his own reputation. He looked at Kincaid, not with fear, but with the cold fury of a man who had been used and then publicly humiliated. The judge's ruling was swift and stunning. He issued an immediate injunction, ordering a complete halt to all railroad construction in or around Stone Creek Canyon. He ordered Silas Kincaid and his company to pay a massive fine for environmental restitution, an amount that would be used to fund the cleanup of the creek. Finally, he ordered that Caleb Stroud, already in custody for attempted murder, be bound over for a full criminal trial. A wave of joyous, disbelieving relief washed through the Apache who had gathered at the back of the courtroom. It was not a loud celebration, but a deep, emotional release, a quiet, heartfelt prayer of thanks. Anea embraced Abby, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. The rest of the townspeople, who had packed the gallery, were silent. It was a heavy, thoughtful silence. They had witnessed not just a legal victory, but a profound moral one. They had seen a powerful man brought low, not by an army, but by the quiet courage of a handful of decent people, a determined lawyer, an honest worker, a brave sheriff, a quiet seamstress, and an honorable chief. As the crowd filed out, Mackay and Abby stood together, the box of evidence resting on the table between them. Justice had been won, but it was not a victory that belonged to one person. It was a communal victory. The fire on the railroad tracks had been meant to destroy the truth, but it had only served to illuminate it for all to see in the quiet aftermath. Mackay reached across the table and placed his hand over Abby's. Their battle was over. Their work of building a home, a true home, was just beginning. The victory in the courtroom did not echo with the sound of cheers, but with the profound, heavy silence of a truth finally acknowledged. The journey back to Stone Creek was not a triumphant parade. It was a somber pilgrimage back to a place that was both wounded and sacred. The black water had receded, but it had left a poisonous scar upon the land, a dark, oily residue that coated the rocks and clung to the roots of the cottonwood trees. The air, which should have smelled of rain-washed sage and damp earth, carried a lingering chemical taint. The creek was silent, the cheerful burble of its current replaced by a slow, sickened flow. The fish were gone, but the people were not. In the days that followed, a quiet, determined miracle began to unfold. It started with the Stone Creek Band. Men, women, and even the older children came down to the creek with shovels and woven baskets. They began the painstaking work of scraping the toxic sludge from the stones, of digging out the contaminated sand from the banks, and carrying it all away to be buried deep in the earth where its poison could spread no further. Then, on the third day, a wagon rumbled up the canyon road. It was not Kincaid's men. It was Widow May. She had a wagon loaded not with flour and nails, but with fresh baked bread, a huge pot of beef stew, and several canteens of clean water. She did not say much, simply set up a makeshift serving station and began to feed the weary workers. Her arrival was like a key turning in a lock. The next day, Jesus Martinez came with his 2 strong sons. They brought their own shovels and did not stop working until the sun went down. A few other families from the town followed, the ones who had been quiet dissenters, the ones who understood that the poison in Stone Creek was a poison in the heart of their own community. There were no grand speeches of reconciliation, no formal apologies. There was only the shared, rhythmic work of healing the land, the scrape of shovel against rock, the grunt of men lifting heavy stones, the quiet conversation between an Apache woman and a baker's wife. These were the sounds of a community being rebuilt, not with lumber and nails, but with mutual effort and a shared, silent understanding. Mackay worked alongside them all, his grief for red clay a quiet, powerful fuel for his labor. He directed the building of new retaining walls, not straight, ugly lines, but gently curving barriers of river stone, designed to slow the water and create deep pools where fish might one day return. He showed them how to plant young willow saplings along the banks, their roots a living net that would hold the soil and filter the water. They dug deep pits near the creek bed and filled them with layers of sand and charcoal, creating simple, natural wells that would provide clean drinking water as the land slowly recovered. In the midst of this communal labor, Abby found her own unique purpose. She saw the children, both from the town and from the band, their lives disrupted, their futures uncertain. With Mackay's blessing, and with the help of Anea and Jesus' wife, she began to build a new kind of structure. It was not a house or a shop, but a simple, open-sided lodge, its posts made of sturdy cottonwood, its roof a thick thatch of reeds that would provide shade from the sun and shelter from the rain. This was to be her workshop, but it was also to be a school. During the day, she brought out her sewing supplies. She taught the girls how to patch trousers and the boys how to stitch leather. She showed them the practical magic of mending what was broken. of making things whole again. But in the afternoons, when the work was done and the air began to cool, she brought out her other tools, a precious few slates, some chalk, and her own worn Bible. She taught them their letters. She was not a master scholar, but she was a patient and dedicated teacher. She taught them the simple, powerful alchemy of turning sounds into shapes, and shapes back into sounds. She watched as a young Apache boy, who could track a deer for miles, struggled, and then finally succeeded in writing his own name. She saw the daughter of a poor farmer, who had never been inside a schoolhouse, read her first complete sentence aloud, her face lit with a pride that was as bright and fierce as the desert sun. She was not just teaching literacy, she was giving them a voice, a tool that no one could ever take away from them. The lodge became a place of quiet creation, a testament to the fact that true strength was not just in fighting what was wrong, but in building what was right. One evening, as the last of the light faded from the sky, a runner came to the lodge. The tribal elders had convened a council, and they had requested the presence of both Anea and Abigail Hart. A great fire burned in the center of the main camp, casting long, dancing shadows. The faces of the elders were serious, etched with the gravity of their history and the weight of their future. Mackay sat among them, not as their chief in that moment, but as another member of the council, his face impassive. An old man, his face a beautiful, intricate map of a long life, rose to speak. His voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of generations. He spoke of red clay, of the stories he had carried, of the wisdom he had embodied. Our brother's last words were not of endings, but of beginnings, the elders said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled people before coming to rest on Anea and Abby, who sat side by side. He told us that the fire is not passed by blood alone. He told us that an heir is a promise, a keeper of knowledge. The world is changing. One kind of knowledge is no longer enough to keep our people safe. He held up a large, beautifully tanned deer hide that had been bound into a book. This is our record, he said. In it, we have always marked the seasons, the hunts, the histories of our families. It is the memory of our people. He looked at Anea. You, daughter of our former chief, sister of our current one, you know the ways of our people. You will continue to mark the passing of the seasons, the stories of our families, in the way it has always been done. You will be a keeper of our past. Then, he turned his gaze to Abby. Her heart began to beat a little faster. You, Abigail Hart, he said, his voice resonating with a deep, formal respect. You were a stranger, and you became our witness. You have the hands that mend what is broken. And you carry a new kind of knowledge, the knowledge of the written word, a language we must now learn to speak if we are to survive. You have shown us that you use this knowledge not for power, but for truth and for teaching. You will be a keeper of our future. The elder beckoned them forward. He laid the open book before them. Together, he said, you will be the keepers of this record. Anea will write in pictures and in memory. Abby will write in words. You will teach each other. You will be two halves of a whole promise. Red clay's fire will not go out. It will now burn with two flames. A quiet murmur of assent went through the council. It was a revolutionary act, a profound redefinition of their most sacred tradition. They were not just accepting Abby. They were weaving her into the very fabric of their future, honoring the truth of red clay's final vision. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the camp was asleep, Mackay found Abby by the newly cleared banks of the creek. The water was already running clearer, its quiet burble a song of healing. They stood together in a comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the canyon. The council has spoken, Mackay said finally, his voice soft. You are a part of our story now. Abby, in a way that can never be undone. I'm honored, she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name, more than I can say. He turned to her then, the starlight catching the serious, gentle lines of his face. He reached out and took her hand. In the stone shelter, I made you a promise of a future, he said. I asked you to build a home with me. I think now I understand what that word truly means. It is not a place of walls and a roof. He paused, his dark eyes searching hers, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that was just for her. "Home is where you stand beside me when the water rises." He did not ask her to marry him in the way her people did. Instead, he reached up and gently took a loose strand of her brown hair. From his own head, he took a single, long strand of his black hair. He laid them side by side in his palm, and, from a pouch at his belt, he took a thin, soft leather cord. With slow, deliberate movements, he carefully bound the two strands of hair together, tying a small, intricate knot that joined them as one. He held it out to her in his open palm, a simple, profound, and unbreakable promise. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his, and held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. A few nights later, a familiar, delicious smell once again filled the air around the central fire. Abby was cooking a large pot of beans, her movements now filled with a quiet, easy confidence. When the meal was ready, she served a bowl to Mackay. He took it and ate in his usual thoughtful silence. Abby watched him, a small, playful smile tugging at the corner of her lips. He finished the entire bowl, then looked up at her, a serious, contemplative expression on his face. He was silent for a long moment. "Less salt," he said finally, his tone one of deep and solemn consideration. Abby's smile broke free. "Because I do not want you to be thirsty anymore," she replied softly. He did not smile back, but the look in his eyes was warmer and brighter than any fire, a look of profound love and deep, contented peace. The water was running clear. The rice was cooked. They were home. The season turned. The rains that followed were not the violent, scouring deluges of the flood, but gentle, life-giving showers that washed the last of the black residue from the rocks and sank deep into the thirsty earth. The willows they had planted along the banks of Stone Creek took root, their slender green shoots a vibrant promise against the rich, dark soil. The water, filtered through the new sand wells, ran clear and sweet, its voice a happy, burbling murmur that had been absent for too long. Life was returning. Their wedding was not an affair of pomp or ceremony. It was a simple gathering on a bright, clear afternoon, under the broad, dappled shade of the oldest cottonwood tree, the one the elders called the grandmother of the canyon. The guests were a small, quiet assembly, a living portrait of the new community that had been forged in the crucible of conflict. On one side stood the people of Stone Creek, Anea at the forefront, her face a beautiful mixture of joy for her brother and a quiet, lingering sorrow for the uncle who should have been standing there. On the other side stood their friends from the town, a beaming widow May, her hands constantly smoothing the front of her best dress, Jesus Martinez with his wife and sons, their faces open and full of gratitude, Sheriff Tom Whitaker, his old suit brushed clean, his badge polished to a high shine, and Miss Eleanor Pike, who looked almost out of place without a stack of legal papers in her hands, a rare, soft smile on her face. Abby wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, one she had sewn herself. In her hair, she had woven the small, knotted leather cord that bound her strand of hair with Mackay's. Mackay wore his finest buckskins, softened by years of use, decorated with simple, elegant quill work. They stood before their friends and family, not as a chief and a seamstress, but as two people who had found in each other the one thing neither had ever truly had, a home. There was no preacher. Their vows were the promises they had already made to each other in the dark of the stone shelter and in the light of their shared work. Sheriff Whitaker, his hat held respectfully over his heart, stood as their legal witness, his presence a symbol that the law of the land now stood in partnership with the ancient laws of the canyon. Miss Eleanor Pike, at Mackay's request, stepped forward. She did not read from a law book or a Bible. She read from a simple piece of paper on which she had written a few words, her voice, usually so sharp and precise in the courtroom, now warm and full of a surprising tenderness. "Some seek to build their houses on foundations of power or of gold," she read, her gaze resting on the couple before her. "Such houses are built on sand, and they cannot stand against the rising water. But you have built your house on a different foundation. You have built it on courage, on truth, and on a shared respect for the land and for each other." May this house you build together be a shelter for the weary, a school for the young, and a testament to the enduring truth that justice, like a clean river, is the lifeblood of us all. May your home be a place where you are always seen, and where you always see the best in each other." When she finished, Mackay took Abby's hands in his. Their eyes met, and in that silent gaze, they reaffirmed every step of the journey that had brought them to this place. It was a promise to face the future not as two separate people, but as two flames, as the elders had said, burning together to create a single, brighter light. In the weeks that followed, the canyon was a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. Mackay, seeing how the flood had reshaped the land, organized a new kind of patrol. It was not a war party, but a creek watch. He and the younger men of the band, sometimes joined by Jesus and his sons, would walk the length of the canyon after every heavy rain. They learned to read the signs of a potential landslide, to clear log jams that could cause new floods, and to monitor the health of the returning ecosystem. It was a new kind of leadership, a stewardship that was not about defending territory, but about nurturing life. Abby's Knowledge Lodge became the heart of the small, recovering community. She hung a simple, hand-painted sign out front, a sign that captured the two halves of her new life. It read, simply, "Needle Map." In the mornings, she did her sewing, mending clothes for the townspeople and crafting beautiful, practical leather goods with the Apache women, blending her skills with theirs. But in the afternoons, the lodge transformed. She unrolled maps of the territory, teaching the children not just how to read the names of the towns, but how to read the land itself, how to understand the flow of rivers and the rise of mountains. Her two worlds, the precise, ordered world of the needle and the vast, open world of the map, had become one. One afternoon, as she was dismissing her small class of students, she saw a familiar figure hesitating at the edge of the clearing. It was the man who had sold the Dry Cedar Chronicle, a stooped, ink-stained man named Silas. He clutched his worn hat in his hands, his face a miserable portrait of shame and regret. He approached her cautiously, his eyes darting around as if he expected to be cast out at any moment. "Ma'am," he stammered, his gaze fixed on his own dusty boots. "Miss Hart, I just wanted to say I am sorry. For that headline, it was a vile thing. Mr. Kincaid, he paid me well, but it was not right. I knew it was not right." Abby looked at the man, at his genuine, painful remorse. She felt no anger, only a quiet sense of pity. Before she could say a word, Mackay, who had been coming to walk her back to their wiki-up, stepped up beside her. He looked at the nervous newspaper seller, his expression not of anger, but of a calm, deep understanding. The man flinched, expecting the chief's wrath, but Mackay simply smiled, a quiet, philosophical expression. "Some words," he said, his voice gentle, "are meant for the wind to carry away." The newspaper seller looked up, a flicker of grateful relief in his eyes. He nodded once, a gesture of profound thanks, and then turned and shuffled back down the road toward the town. Abby watched him go, then turned to Mackay, her heart full. "And some homes," she said softly, "are meant to be stayed in." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and they stood for a moment, watching the long afternoon shadows stretch across the canyon floor, a quiet, contented couple in the heart of the home they had built together. The full rainy season came and went, a time of peace and gentle growth. The willow saplings were now lush and green, their roots holding the banks of the creek firm. One morning, a group of children came running to the lodge, their faces bright with excitement. They had seen them, in the deep, clear pool below the cottonwood tree. A small school of young trout, silver and sleek, were darting through the clean, cool water. Life had truly returned to Stone Creek. That evening, Abby took the small, imperfect silver plate from its protective wrapping. In the soft light of the setting sun, the ghostly image of the canyon wall and the black river of poison seemed less a memory of a disaster and more a historical document, a testament to the truth they had fought for. She walked into the Knowledge Lodge, her lodge, and on the central support post, a place where every student who entered would see it. She hung the small plate on a simple leather cord. It was the first piece of art, the first historical artifact in their new shared library of knowledge. She stood back, looking at the strange, beautiful shadow of their past, a reminder of the cost of their peace. She felt a warm, strong hand come to rest on her shoulder. Mackay stood behind her, his gaze following hers to the silver plate. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long moment. The quiet burble of the healed creek, a gentle song in the background. "We do not just keep the land," Mackay said finally, his voice a low, resonant promise in the twilight. "We keep our word to each other, and in that promise, in that shared commitment to the truth, to the land, and to one another, their love story was not just a passionate rescue in a moment of crisis. It was the quiet, daily labor of building, of healing, of learning, and of choosing each other, every single day, in the heart of the wild and beautiful home they now shared." Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.